Well, hey there, organizedpreneurs. Welcome back to another episode of the OrganizedPreneur Podcast Launchpad. And this is where we talk all things strategy, systems, and streamlining of your business and your podcast. So we help you to turn your calling into content that changes lives. Okay, that's what we do. And so today, you're going to love this episode because today we're going to be diving into the history of podcasts. And so we're going to talk about like where they came from, how they evolved, and why have they become such a powerful force in media today. And this really just kind of came about from my last episode, previous episode, where I talked about why is everybody starting a podcast? And that was a question that I was asked in the previous episode, and so this inspired this episode where I'm going to be talking about the history of it. So maybe some of you that are listening may have wondered, well, if it's so popular, where did it come from? How did this whole thing get started? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Where did it come from? How they evolved, and why has it become such a powerful force in media today? And maybe you have wondered yourself. I know I have. I just never done the research. I never did the research on where they came from, and so until now. But that's what we're going to be talking about. So, like, who started it? Who started the first podcast, and how did it grow from a niche hobby, like, to a multi-billion-dollar industry? And what does the future hold for podcasting? Okay, so if you've been wondering those things, then you are in the right place, because we're going to travel back in time, and we're going to explore the origin, the evolution, and the rise of podcasts. So I'm very excited to do this episode. So let's just rewind back to early 2000. And so, believe it or not, podcasting did not start with Apple or Spotify. I know that's what you're thinking, right? That's probably when I asked you the first question, where did it start from? You probably thought, oh, Apple or Spotify. No, that's not where it started. It actually goes further back than that. So before podcasts, we had what was called the radio shows, which was a primary source of audio content. Like, this was the early digital audio revolution, right? Before we had podcasts, people listened to radio shows, okay, as their primary source of audio content. And so the idea of quote unquote on-demand audio actually started with audio blogs. Wow, in the 1990s. So I know when I said radio shows and audio content, you probably thought, transistor radio. You probably, if you're listening to this, you probably didn't even think back that far, because you may not even know what a transistor radio was or is. But anyway, I digress, because we're not going back that far. But before we had podcasts, people listened to radio shows. And so that was their primary source of audio content. And so I remember, I guess I'm going to say a little bit about it, because I don't mind you knowing, how old I am. But I am old enough to know about transistor radios. I remember having a transistor radio. And I used to think, here's what I used to think. I used to think, before I understood like what that was, I used to think there were people inside of this little bitty, what looked like the size of a big phone, or maybe bigger than that. But I remember sitting on the floor wondering, and I had this little transistor radio, sitting, in the middle of the floor. And I was like, wow, I wonder how those people get inside of that little box. Isn't that crazy? Anyway, so I digress again. Okay. So let me just stick with what I was saying. So before we had podcasts, okay, we had people listen to radio shows. That was me. All right. And it was a primary source of audio content. The idea of on-demand audio actually started with audio blogs back in the 1990s. So obviously I was not born in 1990, okay? So anyway, but this is where on-demand audio started. And this is where tech-savvy users shared MP3 files online. So this is like the early digital audio revolution of podcasts. But the term podcast was first coined in 2004 by a journalist by the name of Ben Hammersley in the Guardian newspaper. And so the name is a combination of iPod, which was Apple's popular MP3 player at the time, and broadcast, hence podcast. So iPod is a combination of iPod and broadcast. And ta-da! There is the name podcast. Bet you didn't know that, huh? Bet you didn't know. And so around the same time, Dave Winner, or Weiner, I think it's Winer, and Adam Curry developed the really simple syndication, better known as RSS for audio. I bet you didn't know that either, huh? So RSS is how users can subscribe and download episodes automatically, right? Using an RSS feed. And so, wow, this is really fascinating because I just love it. I mean, the evolution of podcasting is something I don't know, it's just fascinating to me. Maybe I'm the only one that's fascinated by it, okay? But so the RSS feed is how users can subscribe and download episodes. Now, one of the earliest and most famous podcasts, this is like the first official podcast, okay? The first official podcast was The Daily Source Code by Adam Curry in 2004. And it was a tech-focused show that helped to popularize the idea of podcasting. And this is what inspired others to start their own. Wow, back in 2004. Isn't that fascinating? And so I remember starting my podcast. My first podcast was started in 2013. So it wasn't, that far behind that 2004, like, 10 years or whatever. But then in 2005 to 2010, that's when the rise of podcasting began, because podcasting now had a name. Okay. And then it started to pick up some momentum, especially when Apple got involved, right? And so Apple kind of brought this to the mainstream in 2005. In fact, in June of 2005, Apple added podcasts to iTunes. So now you're probably like, oh, yeah, I remember that now. And so this is what made it easy for anyone to discover and listen to the shows. And that year, Steve Jobs demonstrated podcasting on stage, calling it the next generation of radio. I love it. I love it. But here's the thing. Podcasting was still kind of niched, right? It was still niched. But even then, several big names, they jumped on the bandwagon, right? Like NPR, they launched some of the first podcast versions of their radio shows, like The American Life. right? And then comedians like Ricky Gervais helped to bring entertainment podcasts to the forefront. And educational and business podcasts started engaging and helping professionals learn on the go. So I hope you are enjoying this history of podcasting because I sure am. Then, after professionals started learning on the go and podcasting, became a little bit more mainstream, if you will, there were a few challenges and a few growing pains because they were still not that easy to create, like recording and hosting. Many people they didn't know what a podcast was. And streaming technology wasn't as advanced as it is today. So that's why podcast is it's like a household name. Like kids know what podcasts are because they listen to them. Then came the podcast boom. Fast forwarding from 2000 to 2014. And I remember I had started my first podcast in 2013. So I came in when it was exploding in popularity. And so fast forwarding to 2014 and podcasting exploding in popularity thanks to a little show called Serial. Now, I never heard of that show, but okay. And so in 2014, a journalist by the name of Sarah Koenig launched Serial, a true crime investigative podcast, and the show went viral. It hit over 80 million downloads in its first season. And Serial proved that podcasts could be just as compelling as TV shows. And this kicked off the podcast boom. There you have it. There you have it. So now that we have the boom, what fueled the growth? Well, Apple's iPhone made it easier than ever to listen on the go. And then here comes apps like Spotify, and then there was Stitcher and Overcast and all these other podcast platforms that made it even more accessible thanks to smartphones and streaming technology, right? And then came true crime and storytelling shows. And this became addictive. Like Serial paved the way for shows like Crime Junkie and My Favorite Murder. Now, I personally have never listened to those podcasts, but hey, they're still out there. Okay. And then celebrities and influencers jumped in. Like everyone started having a podcast. Oprah had a podcast. Michelle Obama now has a podcast. And so, like, businesses and brands then begin to see the power of podcasts. So companies realize that podcasts could be a marketing tool. What? And a lead generator. What? Now we're talking. So, fast forward. The modern podcasting era from 2020 to now. Here we are. Podcasting has officially become mainstream, and the industry is bigger than ever. And I mentioned this on my last episode, but I'm going to just mention this again. There are now 3.5 million podcasts that exist worldwide. Okay? 546.7 million people listen to podcasts on the regular. The podcast industry is projected to be worth $17.5 billion by 2030. Okay, I'll pause. And so now what's happening, of course, is because I said I was going to talk about the evolution of podcasting, right? So now there's the rise of video podcasts on platforms like YouTube and Spotify that now allows you to upload your videos, and TikTok. They have made video podcasts more popular. Now, I don't know. I'm not saying that TikTok has podcasts, but they've made podcasting, more popular, video podcasts more popular. So yes, shows like the Joe Rogan Experience have proven that audiences love watching podcasts, not just listening to them. Now, there is a segment that loves audio podcasting, and I'm in that segment. I love audio podcasting. I love to listen to podcasts. And then there's a lot of people that like to listen to podcasts for convenience, like in the car, while they're cooking, things like that. And so podcasting is here, and I believe it's here to stay. Okay? And so what about the future of it? Well, I'm glad you asked, even though maybe you didn't. AI and the future of podcasting is making it so much easier than ever to create and edit podcast episodes. Even personalized AI generated podcasts could be the next big thing. Imagine podcasts tailored to specifically to your interests. Well, listen, there you have it. Okay, I'm not going to keep trying to convince you that podcasting is where it's at, okay? Just because I love it so much. But that's it in a nutshell. From humble beginnings in 2004 to a massive industry, podcasting has proven to be one of the most powerful and personal forms of media. And guess what? It's still growing. Still growing. There's still room for new voices, new ideas, new perspective. It is not oversaturated like some people are saying. Because of that number that I told you, that number that I gave you a few minutes ago about the 3.5 million podcasts that's out there, I mentioned this on the previous episode. There's only like 400,000 episodes or podcasts that's active. There's a clue for you. Okay? So if you've been thinking about launching a podcast, let this be your sign. It's not too late. It's not oversaturated. But the key is doing it strategically with a plan and a clear niche and all of that wonderful stuff. If you want help launching your podcast, launching it the right way with hands-on guidance, then I invite you to go to bit.ly new pod launch for more on how to accelerate your podcasting launch and growth. And I'm going to add a few more links in the show notes as well. So I hope you enjoyed this history. I hope you enjoyed going down memory lane with me a little bit. Yeah, this was great. Thanks for tuning in to the OrganizedPreneur Podcast Launchpad. If you love this episode, subscribe, leave a comment or a review depending on where you are listening to this episode. Share it with a friend. Somebody else needs to hear this too. Until next time, keep organizing your business, your life, and your podcasting journey. Until next time, have a great day. All around in the podcast world, she's renowned.